Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the Randomill 2 plugin for Adobe Illustrator, what it is, how to use it, what's changed since version 1, what's new, and just giving a basic overview of the plugin and the various new additions to it. I'm not going to be comprehensively talking about every new feature and exactly how everything works, but I should cover it with enough depth so that users should be able to figure the rest out on their own. So let's jump into it. And really quick, before we get started, I do think I'll be splitting the video up into chapters, so feel free to kind of hover your mouse over the seek bar of the video if there's a particular piece of information you want to get to and don't want to watch through this whole video. So let's get into it. First of all, how do we open up Randomill? Well, you just go to Window, Extensions, and down here you will see version 1 and version 2 of Randomill. If you have version 1, it'll just show up for you as Randomill. The new version will be installed as Randomill 2, so we'll just click to open that up. And here you go, you have the panel right here. So what is this plugin? What does it do? How does it work? Basically, it will modify the various properties listed here according to some pattern you've set. So that's very vague. What does that mean exactly? Just to illustrate, I'm going to draw a bunch of squares here, copy them over, and let's say we wanted to randomize the fill color of these squares. Well, what we would do is enable the fill color function. We'll unroll the options here, and you can see that there are these 4 modes. Now we want to randomize the fill color, so we're going to click on this random mode, and you'll see down here that there are some sub modes. We can select how exactly we want to randomize the color. We can do it by dialing in this range of hue, saturation, and lightness values. So each color of the squares will be randomly picked from within this range for hue, within this range for saturation, and within this range for lightness. And that's how it'll randomize the colors. You can click over and get different sliders depending on what you're trying to do. So let's say we want to have like a reddish orange with a bit of yellow in there hue. We want it fully saturated, so bright colors only. And let's say we'll want some variation in darkness and lightness, but we want to keep it towards the middle, towards brighter colors. So we've dialed in the range for the HSL values, and now all we have to do, got to make sure fill color is enabled. We'll click this play button. I'm actually going to turn off the stroke for all these squares, and you'll see that each square has been randomized. We can keep clicking it, and it'll pull colors randomly from within this criteria that we've set up. Now that we've, like, let's say we want it more desaturated, you'll see that the resulting squares are now more desaturated. So that's just fill color, right? And then you can also modify stroke color and all these other properties. And they all have various options and can go pretty deep into some of them. But at a basic level, that's how this plugin works. Now, just to illustrate some of the things that you can do with Randomill, before I go too much farther, I'm going to kind of go to the Randomill website. I'm on the sample art page. And on this page, you can see just some of the things, some of the designs I was able to come up with really quickly and easily using Randomill. So on the left here, you'll see that I just started with this one blue square and using the duplication and then randomizing stroke width and stroke color and fill color and position and scale and rotation of all of the generated squares. You can come up with this cool like stained glass looking diamond pattern design. And I go into detail and explain exactly what went into creating each design and how Randomill was used to create it. So if you're interested in seeing some of the possibilities that you can that Randomill is capable of, you can just go to the website, go to this sample art page, and have a look through some of the things that Randomill can do. So with that out of the way, let's talk about some of the things that are new in version 2. So version 2 of Randomill though it may not look like it, has actually been rebuilt from the ground up in terms of its user interface and the back-end scripting aspect of it. It's now built on React.js, whereas the first one was just strictly HTML and native JavaScript. It still runs on Adobe's SEP platform for how it actually hooks into Illustrator. But since I'm using newer web development features, you now need Adobe Illustrator CC 2021 or higher in order to run Randomill version 2. So if you have 2020 or below, it's just not going to load up for you. Definitely something to make sure that you have before you go and try to use this plugin. So what is new in version 2? I've roughly tripled the feature set from the previous version. It's now much more than a randomization plugin. There's a lot of different modes for all these various properties. Like for example, fill color before only had this random mode, and you could only do it from HSL sliders or the color set. With this new version, I've added in 2 more sets of sliders, and I've also added in 3 additional modes that you can modify color with. So there's a ton of new features, and I'll get into some of them in the rest of this video and later on. But with all these added features, I figured it would be best to include a tooltip system. So now if you mouse over and hover over a button or a UI element, this little tooltip shows up explaining what that button does. And most buttons have tooltips for them. And I tried to write them as helpfully as possible, but in some cases where the tooltip still isn't quite clear enough, you can go to the website and I have pages written out for each function that will hopefully make it a little clearer if you're struggling to understand exactly how these functions work. If you get used to the plugin and know what the buttons do and how it works, you can turn tooltips off by going into this settings and just unchecking this tooltips bar here. And there's some other settings here you can play around with to get the user interface to behave exactly how you want it to. So one of the two big additions in this new version would be the duplication and the font functions here. So duplication kind of works differently than the rest of them in that you can only have one object selected when you use it. And you can see here in this layer, in this document, there's only one rectangle. And what you can do is duplicate this rectangle a specific number of times. Like for example, we just have 5 entered here. We'll run this script and you'll see that 5 new rectangles pop up in the layer stack under the original one. Alternatively, you can duplicate it into a grid of specified rows and columns with specified margins, and you can mess with the grid flow and how the margins are calculated and all that, but we'll just just make like a 10 by 10 grid. And you can see that the squares, the original square has been duplicated into a grid, the specified margins. And one thing to note about this new function is that any other functions that you have enabled when using duplication, they will run on the duplicated objects. So you'll create the grid, and then with that grid, you'll then execute the rest of these functions. So for example, let's say I want to randomize the fill color. We'll just set it to HSL mode, this red, yellow kind of range, and we'll duplicate it. You'll see that the grid was created and then the color was randomized from within this range. And that goes for all the rest of these functions as well. So that should basically cover duplication. Now let's go into some of the new features in the color modes or color functions. So the random mode, if you used Randomill before, you should be pretty familiar with. I'm actually going to go ahead and turn off tooltips for now, just so they don't keep popping up. But there are these 3 new modes. So let's see what shift mode does. I'm just going to set the color of each square to be black. Let's actually go into, let's actually set them all to be red. So what shift will do is that it will shift the fill color of each square a certain amount more than the square before it. So let's say we shift the hue 10 degrees from square to square. What will happen is the first square will be unchanged. The second square's hue will be shifted 10 degrees. The third square's hue will be shifted 20 degrees, and so on and so on. So let's see what happens when we do that. And there you go. You get this kind of rainbow effect as the hue gets shifted all the way through the spectrum of color, and then when it goes back to red, you'll see that it kind of restarts. And the reason it restarts is because we have this hue cycling checkbox turned on. So it knows that once you get to the end of a range of possible values, just loop back to the beginning. So if we have that turned off, for example, it'll go all the way through the range. It'll max out when hue is at 360, and then it'll just stop. So that's what these cycling checkboxes do. Now, there's also an option to restart this loop. So let's say we want to iterate hue for the first 5 squares and kind of restart that whole process. We'll just type in 5. Let's actually iterate or shift the hue by a little more so we can see a little more clearly what's going on. Yeah, so you'll see that hue is shifted by 30 degrees for 5 squares, and then it restarts back to the original color and is shifted again. Now, one thing to note is that if all these squares are a non-uniform color, so let's just randomize the color for all these squares. And if we go back to shift it, you still end up with random results, because what it will do is it'll take the existing color of each square and then just add however many degrees of hue to that color. It doesn't take into account the initial starting color of the first square. So that should pretty much cover the shift mode. Let's move on to the loop mode here. So I'm going to click over to loop, and what this does is it will loop through whatever colors you add into this set and apply them in order repeatedly through whatever objects you have selected. So let's add a few colors in. Let's add this red, right? We'll just import the swatch. Let's import this kind of orange circular gradient just to show that we can, and let's do a no color. And let's apply that. So you'll see that because this grid is duplicated in order, right? Layer order is very important here. You can see over here it'll apply the red, the gradient, and then the no color in order as you proceed through the grid or through the layer stack. Pretty simple. You can get some cool checkerboard patterns out of it. All right, moving on to the blend mode. So it does what it says. It blends between colors throughout the selection. So let's blend. Let's add in some colors here. All right, we'll add in the swatches and run the blend. So you can see that in order of the layer stack, it is blended between the colors we've added in order. So it's gone from red to green to blue to this pink color through the layer stack. And stroke color has all the exact same settings and modes as fill color. It's just an independent control for the stroke. Okay, so now we're moving on to this next section of functions. Scale, rotation, position, opacity, and stroke width. They all have the same 4 basic modes. So you'll see if you open up scale, There's random, shift, target, and oscillate. And if we open up position, you see the same 4 modes here. Same with opacity. They all work the same. They just happen to change the different properties of these objects. So I'm only going to cover one, and the rest will work the same way. So let's see which one would best work to demonstrate each mode here. I'm thinking scale probably. Okay, so let's just go with that. So start off with random. If you used Randomill, it works the same way. The only difference addition is now that you can actually scale within text objects as well. So I've just created this text object here. You can go in and actually scale characters, individual characters within the text object. Turn on scale, and I'm actually going to go in and enable this separate play button. Be a good time to introduce this feature. What this does is next to each function, it'll have this play button that will execute just that one function when clicked, even if other functions are enabled, or even if scale is disabled. So let's say, so I'm scaling each character of this text object anywhere from 50 to 200% randomly. And scale is disabled, but if I use this play button, it'll work anyway. So that covers some of the new features. But yeah, it's just random scale, anywhere from 50 to 200%. Pretty simple. And then the step size, like let's say you want the scale to be anywhere from 100%. You either want it to be scaled 50% or stay the same. What you can do is use the step size, and because it can only scale in increments of 50, and the minimum is 50 and the maximum is 100, which means it stays the same size, each object will be scaled either not at all or down to 50%. So you can see roughly half them were scaled to 50%. If you want like an intermediate mode, right? So now each object will either be half its size, stay the same size, or be 50% larger. You can see that's what happened there. So that's how you use this step size. And you can even randomize the anchor around which objects are scaled, right? So we can just check this random anchor. You see the anchor selection is grayed out. And now things are scaled with a little more variety. So for the most part, it works the same as in Randomill version 1. Now let's move on to shift. Shift works more or less the same way as color, in that it will scale incrementally more the farther into the objects it gets. So let's set the shift to 5%. What'll happen is this first square will remain the same. This square will be scaled by 5% higher. This square will be scaled by 10% more, 15%, and so on, and until this square gets like huge. Let's actually see just how big it gets. Yeah, there you go. So again, layer order matters here, because let's say if we were going to randomize the layer order like this, you can see that right now the layers are in a nice descending gradient order. If we randomize them, now they're all over the place. And if we try to apply that scale, because it doesn't know what order the squares are in, they're just going to be completely haphazard. So just hit Control-Z a couple times to get back our original order. So that is the shift mode for scale. Good for incrementally changing the scale from object to object. And if you use this in tandem with like duplication, let's just make an empty object here. Like, let's say we want to copy this square 100 times, we will shift the scale up 1.5% for each copy, an additional 1.5% for each copy, and we'll actually rotate it as well. We'll rotate it by, I don't know, 3 degrees. And rotation will be using the same shift mode. So each square will be shifted, rotated 3 degrees more than the square before it. Let's see what we get. Now, we may not have scaled it enough, so the strokes are overlapping here. If we actually bring the strokes down, you can see that you get this cool spiral pattern. So that is it's a good way to demonstrate just some of the cool stuff you can do with a few clicks with this plugin. All right, let's move on to the target mode of scale. Now this one's pretty simple. All it does is that it will equally increment the scale of each object such that the last object in the selection will be scaled by the target amount. So let's say we want the last square to be scaled 50% of its current size. So I'm just going to enter that in. And what will happen is it will gradually scale down each square in equal increments so that the last square is scaled down to 50%. This is useful, like, let's actually try some kind of rainbow design here. So we're going to turn duplication back on. I'm going to copy this square 100 times. Let's actually shift the fill color over 3.6 degrees because it's being copied 100 times. We'll go through the full range of color. We're not going to restart the loop. And we want this thing to just kind of disappear into itself. So the target width and the target height would be 0%. So the last copy, the 100th copy of this square, will actually be basically invisible because it's going to be 0% width and height of this initial square. And let's turn on rotation just to, make it a little more interesting and see what happens. Everything ended up behind it, and that's because in our duplication, we've checked this duplicate downwards in the layer stack button. Now, because things are getting smaller, we need to duplicate them in front of the original object. And there you go. Now you can see that you get this like rainbow spiral effect here. So that would be like an instance of where you'd want to use the target mode on one of these functions. Lastly, we got Oscillate. It's one of the more interesting modes, but it basically does what it says. It will oscillate the scale between two values over a specified number of steps. So let's say, let's see, what's a good way to demonstrate this? Let's make a square here. It's going to be a red square. We're going to have like a blue stroke. And we're just going to like shift it down diagonally a whole bunch of times. Let's do a few more times. And let's actually reverse this layer order. Go, just so this top left square is the topmost one in the layer stack. So we'll go into scale, and we're going to oscillate both the X and the Y axis from 100% down to, I don't know, let's say 10% over 5 steps. And let's actually decrease the stroke width. So you can see what happened was, as Randomill iterated through these squares from top to bottom in the layer stack, it changed the scale. It oscillated the scale of the squares so that over 5 steps, this square would be scaled down to 10% width and height. and then over 5 more steps back to its original size. Then another 5 steps down to 10% and back. And it just goes and oscillates like that, like a wave, changing this property of scale. So that is the oscillate mode. You can get some really cool stuff when you combine scale oscillation with rotation oscillation. Just for example, let's try to make this, I'll draw like an abstract loop-like thing. Let's get rid of this grid of squares. Make it have a black stroke of 0.5 points. Okay, so what are we going to do with this? We're going to copy it, let's say 300 times. For each copy, we're going to shift the position over, let's say, 1 point horizontally and 0 points vertically. We're going to oscillate the scale. Sure, we'll just leave it like that, except since we're copying it so many times, let's actually increase the number of steps it takes. We'll oscillate it, let's say, over 20 steps. And, you know, a lot of this is trial and error. You can keep hitting Control-Z and changing values and rerunning the script until you get the results you like. And let's actually oscillate the rotation as well. So we're going to oscillate the rotation from negative 90 degrees to 90 degrees over, let's do 60 steps. Let's just see what happens. Okay. So it's kind of interesting, but not quite what we want. Let's actually duplicate this more than that. We'll change the position slightly less. And let's make it take longer for it to oscillate. Let's actually make it like 120 steps for it to rotate. And let's not make the scale so extreme. Let's see what we get there. Something a little bit more interesting, but still pretty dense, I think. Maybe I should have moved the position over a little bit more. Now that's a lot more interesting. That's that pattern doesn't feel quite so cluttered. And you can see how you get, just with some copies and then oscillating scale and rotation, you get some really cool results here. Okay, so we've covered all of the new modes for scale, and those modes also work the same way for rotation, right? You get the shift, target, and oscillate modes. They work the same for position, opacity, and stroke width. Have all the same modes. So I'm not going to go into any one of these. Basically, if you just paid attention during scale, it works the same way. So let's move on to blend mode. Now, blend mode is the same. It's just a list of the blend modes, and currently it's just to randomize the blend modes of objects. So to illustrate that, let's make like a gradient as a background, and we're going to copy into a grid a bunch of these squares. And then with those squares selected, let's randomize their blend modes. And you can see that you get these interesting transparency effects. Let's actually set them to have this red color. Yeah, so now if I just click on a random one, you can look at the blend mode in the transparency panel, and you can see that they're all random. And you can turn them all on and off. Like, let's say we only want normal and multiply. Run that. We'll see that each one will be only one or the other if you look back in the blend mode panel. So that pretty much covers it with blend mode. It's remained unchanged from the previous version of Randomill. Moving on to layer order. Now for layer order, there's basically one new mode. The randomize and reverse mode have been the same since Randomill 1.0. It has been a little bit improved in terms of like the algorithm, which actually randomizes the layer order. Now it's guaranteed to touch every object in the selection, whereas before it was a slightly imperfect algorithm that couldn't quite guarantee that. So let's just make a bunch of squares just to illustrate random layer order changing. All right, let's actually randomize the fill color here. Okay, so there's our layers. Randomize the layer order. You can see they all change. Just keep clicking. Let's make this one a little more visible. It's just white. So that randomizes the layer order. Reverse just reverses it. You'll see that this top layer, once I reverse the layer order, will now be at the bottom. Just kind of flips the whole thing around. Now this arrange mode, what it does is it will sort the layer order based on each object's position in the document. So let's draw a few squares. Let's copy these and randomize the fill color again. Let's make it vibrant colors here so we can tell what's what. Make that one yellow. This one like pink. This one purple, sure. Okay, so we're going to go in, we're going to randomize layer order so they're not in any particular order. And then to demonstrate what this arrange mode does, you'll see that if we set leftmost objects on top, what we will get is that the blue square, since it's the one most to the left, it will end up on top of the layer stack. And then the rest of the layer stack will go in order of how leftward each object is. So it should go blue, orange, green, purple, pink, yellow. And once we click it, we'll see that's exactly what's happened. So that should pretty much cover it for layer order. This is really useful for getting objects arranged if you're running other functions that are dependent on layer order, such as any of these three functions for position, rotation, scale, and so on. Okay, let's move on to selection. Okay, so moving on to selection, just to demonstrate, let's create a grid of squares. Make this a red square. Randomize the fill color. Okay, sure. So we've got our grid here. Let's say we want to randomly select some of them. We'll go into the random mode. This works the same as in Randomill 1.0. We can select either a percentage or a specific number. Let's say I only want 4 random squares selected out of this selection. You can run it. Drag them out here. There you go. You see those are the 4 squares that it selected. If we want a percentage, let's say I want 20% of these squares, run it. And it will select 20 squares. Should be 20. Yeah, we created a 10 by 10 grid, so there's 100 total squares, so 20%, 20 squares. Now, what's new is these other 3 modes here. What these do is select this same percentage or count from a place in the layer stack. So let's actually shift the hue of these squares a little bit. Just so we can differentiate them in the layer stack. Go back to selection. Okay, so let's say we want the top 20% of squares in the layer stack. That'll just be like selecting like that. You can see that it's selected the top 20 squares. And the reason these squares are on the bottom of the grid is because in duplication, we actually have this duplicate downwards in the layer stack checkbox turned off. Now we could easily just reverse that, right, with the reverse layer order. And now that it's reversed, if we select from the top, now it'll be the top of the grid. And it works the same for the middle and the bottom. So if you want to select the middle 20 squares out of the layer stack, there you go. This is useful for creating like sub-selections when you're randomizing large groups of objects and you only want like 20% of like 1,000 objects. You only want to shift their color a little bit just to add something to the design or pattern. It's a good overall utility to have for selection. Okay, last but not least, let's move on to font. So font randomization is new to Randomill 2.0. I'm going to create just a text object. And turn on font. Let's take a look at the interface here. What Randomill does is it reads the list of installed fonts from Illustrator and outputs them as a tree here that you can peruse and select from. And let's say we want to randomize the font for each word in both of these text objects. So we'll select both text objects. We will use the word sub mode here. And let's just go ahead and use every installed font. So we're going to click on installed fonts and let's see how that turns out. There you go. You can see that out of the entire list of installed fonts, fonts were randomly chosen and applied on a word basis to both text objects. So you can select which fonts you want. Let's say you only want Adobe Caslon, Clean, and we can actually search. Say we want Helvetica. All right, Helvetica New. It'll now randomize that with using just those fonts. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that some fonts, like let's say we want to use Adobe or Agency, right? It's only got 2 sub-fonts in the Agency FB family. So we'll select Agency, and we also want, let's say, Helvetica New LT Pro, which has a ton of sub-fonts. It's got like 30 or something sub-fonts. We'll select all that. Now, this is where this normalized font randomization checkbox can become useful. If this is turned off, each one of the sub-fonts within these 2 families have an equal chance of being chosen. And because Helvetica has so many more sub-fonts than Agency, chances are that Helvetica is going to be chosen for each word. So let's run that and see what happens. So if you look over here, for any given word, it's pretty much always Helvetica. In fact, I am struggling to find any Agency. Oh, here we go. Here's a word there where Agency was chosen. Now, to get around this, you can check this normalized font randomization checkbox, and what it will do is for each word or whatever subset of text, it will randomly pick the font family first and then randomly pick a sub-font from within that family to apply to the word. So with this checked, there's now a 50-50 chance of any given word being either agency or Helvetica. You can see we can see a lot more agency in here, and then out of the Helvetica words, they are all the various sub fonts within the Helvetica New family. And that pretty much covers it for font. Let's see, scale also works on a text basis in the random mode, so you can randomly scale words or characters. And I'm trying to think, I think stroke width does as well. Yeah, so you can adjust the stroke width of individual words or characters. And same with colors. So you can change the colors of words. Now it's only within the random submode, because shift, loop, and blend all require knowing in advance how many objects there are. So let's say we want to randomize the fill color of every word. Run that, and you can see that the words have been randomized. Okay, that should pretty much cover it. I think that's about a good overview for all of the things that Randomill, the new version of Randomill, has. It's a much more capable plugin at this point. It has a much more flexible user interface, a lot more functionality. And I hope if you are a customer or if you choose to buy this plugin, that I hope you get a lot of good use out of it. Thanks for watching the video, everyone. I'll see you next time.